The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution, movie review. So this is a documentary. It came out in 2015, and I actually vaguely remember hearing some of the buzz about it on the internet and being interested in it, but unable to track it down at the time. I'm out here in Vietnam. I saw it, well, just today actually, last night and today, as a result of kind of one of those internet searches. So I was on YouTube. I wanted to find like a clip of the Black Panthers to kind of show to my wife, and I was trying to, explain some history. And this is one of the first things that kind of popped up on YouTube. The Black Panthers, Vanguard of the Revolution. I'll link down below, but of course, as always with YouTube, like, the copyright police will probably get this one sooner or later because I don't think it's legally up there. But it's up there at the moment, and well worth seeing. I mean, like, no sense wasting your time listening to me talk about the movie, right? You might as well stop this video, go and watch the real thing, and your time would be much better spent. I'm going to talk about it anyways, though, because that's just what I do. So this is one of the first videos that came up, and I was just kind of going to watch, like a couple minutes of it to see some clips, and then I just got sucked in. The storytelling in this one is really good. They're packing a lot in a very small amount of time. Well, a medium amount of time. The documentary is about 2 hours. But each individual event is encapsulated in a very short amount of time. But it just goes from event to event to event, and it's got good dramatic music from it, and it's got fascinating archival footage. And it's just fascinating to watch, and I got sucked into it. It was round about the time I started the movie. It was kind of late at night anyways. So I watched about an hour of it before I said, okay, I need to turn this off and get some sleep. And then came back the next morning and kind of rewatched it and finished it off. Yeah, so in terms of viewing, it's just very well done, very fascinating. Of course, your individual mileage is going to vary on this, depending on how much you already know about the Black Panthers and about the FBI and about the COINTEL program and stuff like that. I'm obviously a little bit older, so a lot of this stuff, like the assassination of Fred Hampton and the COINTEL programs and stuff like that, is stuff that I learned 20 years ago, when I was 18 or 19 or something like that. But it blew my mind when I learned about it, right? Because it's not something they teach you in schools. So presumably out there are plenty of 18 and 19-year-olds who this documentary is their kind of first exposure to that whole story. And yeah, it's like if you don't know what went on, this documentary is not a bad introduction to it. Now, yeah, again, in my case, I knew a lot of this stuff already, although not everything. And maybe I'll get in a minute to kind of talking about some of the things that I didn't know that surprised me a little bit that I learned from this documentary. But I was familiar with the basics of the Black Panthers already. This had been an interest of mine when I was much younger. I had, when I was in college, I had read books on the Black Panthers, done reports on the Black Panthers, watched other documentaries on the Black Panthers because there's a lot of other stuff out there. So I knew who Bobby Seale and Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver was, and I knew a number of these events already. So I might as well just kind of get it out of the way here and talk about the problem with this movie. And I don't want to say flaw, because flaw implies that something was kind of done wrong. And really, this is inevitable, because the basic problem is you've got way too much ground to cover and only 2 hours to do it. and they're just speeding through stuff, and they're not explaining half the stuff well, and they're leaving stuff out, and it could possibly get confusing. But it's entertaining, right? The pacing of it kind of keeps you very entertained. So, I mean, a documentary is, whenever you watch a documentary, you're watching it at least half for being entertained. Because if your purpose was to study, you could go get a book. I mean, like, with something like the Black Panthers, where there's a lot of archival footage, you do want to kind of supplement with that with the visuals as well. But being entertained is one of the reasons that you would pick up this documentary instead of going for like a more formal academic study of this. So to a certain extent, if it's entertaining, it's good enough. And if it's providing like an introduction to the subject material, maybe that's good enough. But yeah, just 2 hours is not enough to do this material justice. I mean, to just highlight some of the stuff that's just getting kind of very briefly skimmed over here. They did not talk at all about Stokely Carmichael or H-Rap Brown. Both Stokely Carmichael and H-Rap Brown appear kind of briefly in some of the archival footage, but I don't think anyone ever says who they are, what their significance was. They don't talk about SNCC and SNCC's alliance with the Black Panthers, which of course was where Stokely Carmichael and H-Rap Brown come in. Angela Davis does not get mentioned at all in this entire documentary, right? So there are all these stories, all these threads that they just don't have time to get into. And even with the stuff that they do get into, right? So they talk about Huey Newton and how he was arrested for killing a cop, and then how this was this big trial and then eventually led to the acquittal. But, you know, what exactly happened that night? Like, did Huey Newton shoot first at the cop? Did the cop shoot back at Huey Newton? They don't go into that at all. They just said Huey Newton was arrested for killing a cop. And then they talk about like the media thing around it. And then they talk about how he was eventually acquitted. I think they only have like one line, like he was acquitted because the jury found evidence that the case had been tampered with. And I mean, I think that's true. The case had been tampered with, but there still is a question of what happened at that night. The same thing happened with Eldridge Cleaver's shootout with the police. Now, I mean, like, again, to be fair, as with the Huey Newton story, the story of Eldridge Cleaver's shootout with the police, there's so many different versions of this, and I think there are different versions at different times. Like Eldridge Cleaver said one thing in 1968, and I think he said another thing in 1980, when he kind of came back as a born-again Christian. And then the police versions and stuff like that. But, I mean, you'd think you'd at least want to address that. I mean, they talk about Eldridge Cleaver going out to seek a confrontation with the police. Then they talk about Bobby Hutton getting killed by the police and kind of them getting arrested. But you know, did Eldridge Cleaver ambush those policemen or not? Like, not talked about at all. Yeah, what else do they... the rest of the Panther 21. There are a lot of interesting side stories there that they don't very briefly just kind of allude to but don't get into. Well, no, actually, to be fair, they get into it a bit. You can only... I didn't expect them to do much more than this. But, you know, there was that whole... They talk about the fundraising at kind of rich people's houses, like at Jane Fonda's house. There was a big one at... What's the guy's name? The guy who did West Side Story. Bernstein or something? He had a big fundraising, and Tom Wolfe was there, and Tom Wolfe wrote like a whole essay about it, describing the interaction between these kind of Hollywood elites and the Black Panthers. Actually, having brought that up, that is probably just as well that got cut off. Like the documentary did not have time to get into that. You know, the Chicago 8 trial. So the murder of Fred Hampton, they did a decent job, but they could have done more with that. The Chicago 8 trial, sorry, I'm jumping all over here. Chicago 8 trial, they did not have time to go into that story. So they didn't talk about, you know, like, what was the significance of that trial. I mean, they talked about Bobby Seale's involvement on it because it was about the Black Panthers, but you didn't get any other significance of that trial. And what else? I mean, there's just tons of stuff that they did not have time to get into because they were just going so quickly through everything. And that's the thing, is like this isn't like you, I mean, you want to do the story justice, you can't do this in 2 hours. This needs to be like a 10-episode documentary miniseries, like, you know, like one of those Ken Burns things where he does like a whole series on something. And like apparently that's in development or something. Like HBO is doing like this big series on the Black Panthers, which, I mean, I don't know if that will come out or when that will come out or whatever. Until that comes out, while we're waiting for it, the other interesting thing to check out, this is an oldie but a goodie. It's Eyes on the Prize. Now again, you can find this on YouTube. I don't think it's legally there, so you know how these copyright things go on YouTube. It will probably disappear and then it will reappear and somebody will re-upload it and then it'll get taken down again because of a copyright claim. But at the moment, you can search for Eyes on the Prize. You can find this on YouTube. This was a documentary series by PBS, which is excellent. I can't recommend this enough. There's actually 2 parts. There's 1 through 6, which is the first part, and that was made in 1987. But then they did the second part, which is episodes 7 to 12, which they filmed a few years later. The whole thing is worth watching, but the second part in particular gets into kind of the Black Power thing and the Black Panthers. And they have, because it's 12-hour miniseries, they have time to get into stuff like the murder of Fred Hampton and kind of get into it a bit more, how ridiculous these police claims were and how the Panthers kind of set up Fred Hampton's house as a museum. It's another reason, I guess, kind of coming to this documentary at an older age and kind of knowing a bit more about it, why I'm a little bit less impressed with this than I would have seen it at a younger age, because a fair amount of the documentary footage in this, the Black Panthers Vanguard film, I had already seen in the Eyes on the Prize miniseries. But the other advantage of Eyes on the Prize is they kind of talk a lot more about, I mean, it's about the whole civil rights movement in general. So, you know, the Black Panthers were only part of that. There was the Black Power movement actually came out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC as it was known, which was became increasingly radicalized by figures like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown near the end of the 60s, and SNCC formed a strategic alliance with the Black Panthers at one point. And you get more of a sense of that through the Eyes on the Prize documentary. You know, again, it's 12 hours long, so it's they can get into more of this. So that aspect of it, yeah. Well, I mean, watch that if you have the time. It's a fascinating documentary. Okay, going back to this one, the Black Panthers, the Vanguard Revolution, the Vanguard Party, the 2015 documentary that I just watched and I'm already forgetting the name of. Yeah, things that I really liked about it. The soundtrack was really good. They got a lot of really good music from the era to kind of make it seem really cool and kind of really, well, I don't know actually. As I'm talking, I'm realizing that there's a problem with kind of using this rock music to kind of make things cool, because then you get kind of into the whole romanticization of the violence element and stuff like that. But it does kind of come off as really cool. And they have a lot of footage of the Black Panthers. I mean, not just Bobby Seale and Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, but like, you know, some of these block parties or rallies or stuff like that. And you can see like the fashion, the sunglasses and the afros and the berets and the leather jackets. And it just looks really cool. And you get like a sense of that era. And they not only have the soundtrack from like the, you know, the Motown music of the day or whatever, but they have like footage of the Black Panthers kind of singing the revolutionary chants, which is good. I mean, it's got a flow to it. It's got a rhythm to it. You're like, yeah, I can get into this. They've got like a block party of like a Free Huey song and everyone dancing around to it. And you think, yeah, this is really fun to watch, or looks really cool, or you get a sense of that whole era. And that's really cool. They don't really have time to develop any of the characters in depth, but they do kind of set up some interesting personality conflicts or some personality arcs or something. Like Eldridge Cleaver, they get him on, they introduce him as like, you know, this kind of literary star who was kind of getting the Panthers like a lot of respectability from the white left. And then they have these interviews with people who say, boy, Eldridge was great. You know, he could give these speeches. He knew exactly what to say. And then they say, oh, but he was crazy. Like, he got a lot of people hurt and he was devastating to the party. And then they just kind of leave it there and go off. And that's just... Now, I think I've read online some people have been kind of critical of that kind of sensationalism of the problems with the Panther Party leadership. Like, this was, they viewed it as kind of undermining the legacy of the Panthers. I don't know, but from like a storytelling element, I mean, that's a hook. You're like, well, what happened with it? Now they do kind of, yeah, they don't do as much with it as they could. Because having introduced that hook, then they just kind of drop Eldridge Cleaver's storyline. And it doesn't kind of pop up till later. And then later it does kind of become interesting again. But, you know, those kind of little hooks just make this... I mean, that's why you can't stop watching it. You're just like, oh, I'm just going to watch it for like 5 minutes. And then you are hooked on this movie. Just fascinating stuff. Yeah, I guess while I'm getting into this, I said at the beginning that I already knew kind of a lot of this stuff, but there was some stuff that I didn't know, which was kind of fascinating to learn about. The Panther 21 thing, I only kind of vaguely knew about. I didn't quite realize their full significance at the time. And I had no idea that the Panther 21 ended up getting expelled from the party later. And that was, you know, that was another thing that was just so briefly covered. But yeah, interesting. That whole split between Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver is something I never knew about when I was younger. And I went through a period when I was really interested in the Black Panthers and was watching a lot of these documentaries and reading a lot of these books, and I felt like, I don't know, maybe I just missed it, but I felt like it wasn't something people were talking about a lot in the documentaries and stuff in the 90s. I became aware of it just within the past year. I was, you know, on one of those internet searches and was reading about the split between Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. I wonder, but because this documentary came out in 2015, I wonder if this has kind of had an influence on kind of Wikipedia pages and stuff like that since then, that it's become more prominent. But yeah, that whole thing was fascinating. And they get their hands on the taped phone conversations between Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver, so you can listen to the phone conversation where Huey Newton expels Eldridge Cleaver from the party. Now, they actually don't say where they got their hands on that phone conversation. I'm guessing this must have come from the FBI, because, you know, the FBI was recording all their calls back then. I was just at the Wikipedia page for this movie, and the Wikipedia page said that actually there was a lot more taped phone conversations that the director wanted to get, and he couldn't get them from the FBI, despite repeated Freedom of Information requests. So what's going on there, huh? Probably nothing, to be fair, because I think the FBI has a reputation for being notoriously difficult about these Freedom of Information Acts. And they've got a reputation for fighting tooth and nail to kind of keep secret all this stuff they don't need to keep secret. Even though Congress has dictated by the Freedom of Information Act that we now can legally get access to this information, the FBI has never been entirely cooperative about that. So, probably shouldn't read too much into that. But you never know, huh? I mean, right? I mean that that maybe there is something they're trying to keep secret. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Who knows? I don't want to get too deep into conspiracy theory land. But yeah. This is a digression of sorts, but I was having this conversation at work just the other day with people about these ridiculous conspiracy theories that people believe. You know, the 9/11 conspiracy theory, the Sandy Hook conspiracy theory, the Flat Earth conspiracy theory. And they were like, you know, how do people believe in this crazy stuff? And I said, well, you know, I don't want to endorse any of these crazy theories. But I can understand to a certain degree why people get kind of led down this road, because when you get into like the COINTEL stuff, the COINTELPRO, which they talk about in this documentary, and they also talk about it in other places like Eyes on the Prize, and you find out like the stuff we know that are, you know, the conspiracies that we know our government was doing, then I'm sure it's easy for some people to just kind of imagine all these other things that our government could be behind. I don't believe for a second any of those other crazy conspiracy theories, because they're just out of proportion to kind of any fixed kind of view of reality. But yeah, it is easy to see why people become distrustful of the government. Sorry, that was a tangent. Point being, that was an interesting little side story about the split between Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver. And that archival recording footage that the director got his hands on that was interesting. And then they talk Bobby Seale's campaign for mayor, something I knew a little bit about, but I'd never really seen, I think, and explored much in a documentary. Most histories of the Panthers, or documentaries on the Panthers, do not like to talk about Huey P. Newton's later years and kind of how he was becoming a bit crazy. This documentary, to their credit, did kind of talk about that at the end. They could have talked about it more, but yeah, again, they've got a limited space to talk about stuff. Speaking of stuff they could have talked about more, it's how Eldridge Cleaver kind of went crazy near the end, and you know, had alliances with North Korea, and then they mentioned this very briefly at the end, you know, and at the end of the movie where they've got the text kind of coming up to kind of summarize each character's story. They do mention that he became a born-again Christian and he endorsed Ronald Reagan. But you know, that's really kind of that there's obviously so much more to that crazy story, as you can imagine. And I mean, I think Eldridge Cleaver had a drug problem as well throughout the 80s. Eldridge Cleaver and Timothy Leary in Algeria, another thing they don't have time to get into. I'm going to stop complaining about all the stuff they didn't have time to get into, because of course they didn't. It was only 2 hours. It was, for what it was, a fascinating little documentary. The archival footage was great. The music was great. The storytelling abilities were great. There's just a lot of stuff they didn't have time to get into. And I think some stuff they did have time to get into, but they chose not to for whatever reason. Like the Huey Newton, the shootout with the police. What really happened there? I mean, I know you can't go in depth, but you can give maybe 2-3 minutes kind of explaining it. The Eldridge Cleaver shootout with the police, what really happened there? Again, could have given us maybe 2-3 minutes explaining it. Maybe they just shied away from it because of the controversies. Oh, who knows? Maybe the version I watched on YouTube was edited. You never know about this. I don't think so, though. I think that was the whole movie. I think they would have had time to get into this stuff a little bit. Maybe they just didn't want to open that can of worms. On the other hand, once you start saying, oh, this would only have been 2 extra minutes and this would only have been 2 extra minutes, those 2 and 3 extra minutes would kind of add up, wouldn't they? And then you're adding like another half hour of footage. So that's how you get a documentary down to 2 hours, is cutting off two minutes here, cutting off 2 minutes there, to get it down to a reasonable length. Anyways, for all its flaws and all the stuff that it doesn't cover, it's a great documentary. Well worth watching. You can find it on YouTube at the moment. And if they've taken it down by the time you're watching this video, I'm sure you can find it somewhere else on the internet. Check it out.